Since the beginning of this podcast, almost 100 episodes ago, I have been mining my 30-year Superman fandom, starting with that tattered red cape, within the larger context of the character's rich 85-year mythology, examining, discovering, and reconsidering the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Now, our milestone 100th episode beckons, and the journey continues. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Electric Til 1 Million, Part 6, and joining me to discuss the DC 1 Million event is renowned Superman fan and podcaster, Michael Bailey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's very nice finally getting to talk to you and not just hear this introduction and listen to the rest of the episode.
Yes, this is the first time that you and I are actually speaking. We've connected via social media, which has been terrific. And I did want to take this opportunity sincerely to thank you for all of your kind words and your support of this podcast. You know, you've been at this for a long time. I think anyone who's been in the Superman fandom and listening to Superman podcasts is probably well familiar with who you are. And so to have you be as generous and gracious as you have been really means a lot, and I really appreciate it. So I just wanted to publicly, officially thank you for all of your support.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm a big believer in supporting other Superman shows, podcasters in general. That's been my kind of what I've done since I started podcasting. And back in back in 2010, a bunch of us for about 2 or 3 years had a Superman podcast network where we all kind of we had like a central location where they could post shows. We all had our own feeds and stuff, but and that broke up, as internet things are bound to do. But when I was realizing that I didn't know who the new player or the newer players, because you've been at this for a while, I started poking around, and your show came up as a recommendation, and I'm glad I found it.
That's awesome. I'm so glad that you found it. And as far as your podcasting efforts, people might know you from your Superman shows, from Crisis to Crisis, or It All
Mm-hmm.
Comes Back to Superman. I know you have other shows as well. And I know that we have different approaches, not just you and me, but all of the Superman podcasts out there. I know in terms of how you're going through the material, right? You're going at a much slower, more methodical pace than these huge chunks that we cover on here. But that's the thing. I think the material lends itself to different types of coverage, and it's all good.
Yeah, back when we started from Crisis to Crisis in 2009, it was supposed to be a 5-year journey. That didn't happen. Just real life kept getting in the way. There were times where I couldn't record. There were times where Jeff couldn't record. And when we got to where there was 4 titles a month, we could not do all of that in one episode. That it was breaking me as an editor. It was seriously like these things were like 4 or 5 hours long, and I'm like, yeah, but indexing shows used to be more popular. I will never do another one. If I ever cover anything with Superman again, it will be very similar to what you're doing. I'll do large chunks at a time because it's fun. I'm dedicated. There are people that like, the granular look, but man, it's work.
For sure. I admire the patience and the restraint I think that it takes. I think that's probably, other than the fact that you and others out there are already sort of covering that ground the way that you are. I think for me the other thing too is just that I'm too excited to get through everything that I want to cover, and I think to go at that pace, just for me, I think it would test my patience too much. So for you and other shows that are able to do that, I really do admire that.
Yeah, it's fun mainly because I think what we're doing and the people that seem to like the show are, I mean, when it launched, we were very fortunate to have the Superman homepage's support. I've been working with the Superman homepage since 2001, so I've had a long history with Steve, and he posted us when we first started, which gave us a bigger platform than I had previously had. And what I found is there are a lot of post-crisis Superman fans out there. They're very opinionated, and they like the fact the initial audience and even the people that have picked us up now, because I get an email every once in a while like, I just started listening to the show, and I'm like, you poor bastard. there's a lot there's a lot to go through. Just skip to the death. That's what a lot of people do. But there are people that like going through the issues because they remember reading them as they were growing up. So it works on a number of levels. I think what I like about what you do, is you're able to take more of a 1,000-foot approach. Like, you get into specifics, but you're able to look at kind of the themes and what the writers and artists and all them were doing on a whole, whereas we're kind of doing it, like figuring it out later, essentially. I recently just listened to your Exile episode, um, and the way you covered it, I really liked, because I think you covered the major beats of the story and gave it its due, and then followed by talking about everything up to Day of the Krypton Man. So, yeah, I really respect what you do too. We're gonna wax each other's cars at the beginning of this episode.
Now we'll dive into DC 1 million, but I will just echo what you said, that there are a lot of post-crisis Superman fans out there, because I see it. As you know, I do these Triangle era events each year, and we always have some sort of Death of Superman coverage as well. And those episodes do tend to pop a little bit more when I look at the statistics. It's like, okay, like people definitely are, definitely have an interest in this era, as an interest we share, of course. But yeah, it's nice to know that people are out there and looking for this kind of content.
Hmm.
So, whenever I have a first time guest on the show, I do like to start with the question about their Superman fan journey. Now, this could be its own episode, so I'll just ask you, I suppose, for kind of the broad strokes, the major tent poles of your Superman fandom. What got you in, and what's kept you here, and has anything lost you and gotten you back? What are some of the sort of the big picture aspects of your Superman fan journey?
Yeah, I was, because I've listened to the show, I was expecting this, and I'm like, I'm not gonna sit here and go into the specifics. Um, in a broad sense, Superman's been part of my life since as far as I can remember. I was born in 1976, so that was 2 years before Superman the movie. So the Christopher Reeve films and the Super Friends were my first introduction to the character. And I loved them, but my deep dark secret is that I was a Batman fan at first. Loved the Adam West TV show. When I got my Superpowers toys, Christmas '85, I was most excited to get the Batmobile. But in 1987, I I have three older sisters, and we all had various degrees of jacked up grills, uh, and it was a sliding scale, with my eldest sister being okay, but me having like this giant overbite. So we were all going into orthodontics, and the orthodontist we went to, because I couldn't stay at home alone, being so young. My mom would take me, and Dr. Ty's waiting room was lousy with comic books. Like he subscribed to Superman, the Superman titles and the Batman titles, and there was this one issue that caught my eye, that it was just like, what's going on here? It's an imaginary story, but Pete Ross is dead, and like all of the villains are coming out of the woodwork. What? Okay, I don't want to read this. And then I picked up another one which had Superman and Superboy fighting, and then we had to go because it was time to leave. And I don't know how long later. I wasn't writing this down, but I found that issue and another issue of Superman. And I opened the Superman issue, and there's Lana Lang sitting on a fence post. And there's Clark Kent, not Superman, Clark Kent in glasses, ripping a tree out of the ground. And I'm like, what's going on here? That's Lana. She's not supposed to know he's Superman. And then 2 pages later, the Kents show up. I'm like, okay, I got to get this. And with Superman #8 in Action 591 was my launch point. And it was about a year later, with the lead up to Exile, that it went from being, I'm just going to get these, to I need to get these, and it's non-negotiable. And that launched me into being a Superman fan more than anything. And as I grew up, I got more into watching all the different TV shows and movies, and As an adult, discovering the radio show thanks to archive.org. There were 2 periods where I didn't read the Superman books. Right around 2010, I dropped out because I was just done. And then I came back because Action Comics number 900 was coming up. And I joke, if you've ever seen the movie Outsiders, there's a moment where Matt Dillon's character says there isn't going to be a Rumble without him. There isn't going to be an anniversary issue of Action Comics without me. And I'm like, great, I'm back. What do we got? The New 52. Launched the very same year. And then when Bendis revealed the identity, I dropped out for about 3 years. That's not what I wanted in Superman, and I knew where the door was. But now with everything going on right now, I'm back. I'm reading all the books, and it's weird because it isn't my Superman, but it's a Superman I enjoy reading. I've really become an omnivore when it comes to the character. No matter the era or anything, I try to find something to like, and it's just kind of they're telling stories right now that appeal to my sensibilities as a Superman fan. So
It's great to hear all of that, and it's fair to say we're similarly aligned on a lot of what you just laid out, and I really identify with this notion of, you know, sort of who my Superman is. And for me, it is this triangle era Superman. That's home base for me, and that's sort of always the standard or the default. But I can appreciate other incarnations, and even more so now, having done this podcast and reading and learning and exploring and filling in gaps and kind of getting a sense of the bigger picture. And I'm with you. I think what's going on right now, I think the stories are stronger than they've been in a while. And while it still might not be our Superman per se, it's pretty damn close. I really
yeah,
feel, I do feel very much at home in these current stories that are going on right now. So it's a good time for sure.
yeah. Rebirth was like the breath of fresh air I needed after the New 52. I have a friend. You had him on recent episode of The Adventures Continue. John Wilson, total diehard New 52 fan. And I love John. We've been friends for years. And I just kind of kept my head down through the New 52, tried to enjoy what I could. But by the end, I was just like, man, this is just not working. And then Rebirth happened, and it was like this breath of fresh air. And it's like every once in a while they decide, why don't we just tell Superman stories? You know, why don't we? Let's not try to reformat the hard drive, reconfigure the character, try to make him relatable to a new younger audience. Why don't we just tell Superman stories and see where that gets us?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Amazing. Real quick, just going back to your experience at the orthodontist's office, did you or your siblings have a palate expander by any chance?
No, we were, I guess, fortunate with that. We all went through braces, headgear, um, retainers, the whole 9 yards. So,
All right. I can't complain too much, but I did have a palate expander along with braces, and not fun. Glued to the roof of your mouth, brackets on the teeth. My mother had to take the little key and rotate it periodically to stretch the mouth. Oh, terrible
yeah,
memories of that.
I've seen kids with braces today, and you can't even tell. And I'm like, I had to bring a toothbrush to school with me because I had to brush my teeth after lunch because otherwise it's just full of food. So,
Yes. All right.
and
So,
and I
no, go
and I
ahead.
may have stolen the issue where he revealed his identity to Lois, Action 662 from The Office, because I couldn't find it. That may have happened. I think the statute of limitations has run out on that, though.
I think you'll be all right, man. If there's one to steal, though, that's a good one. That was a good pick. So, DC 1 million.
Hmm.
A lot to unpack here. I want to actually start with a follow up to a couple of our earlier episodes because in the course of this event, I've been talking a lot about a specific issue of Wizard Magazine, number 86, cover dated October 1998. This was my first issue. I'll hold it up for people watching on YouTube. The first issue of Wizard that I ever owned. I had the Hulk cover, but I recently was able to track down a copy of the Daredevil cover at my local comic shop, Oh Yeah Comics in Harrison, New York, one of our sponsors, great store. And this is the issue with that article I've been referencing, Clark Kent, all about everything that was wrong with the Superman books at the time, according to the Wizard staff. So later in this episode, I want to toss a few of those at you and get your take. But I just wanted to update the audience that I was able to track this down. I'm very happy about this. But what I'll mention right now is there is an ad for DC 1 Million. So again, the timing of this lines up perfectly. So we have an ad
Hmm.
here, and it says, "The revelation of a utopian future, a promise of heroism untainted by time, a dark alliance determined to lay waste to it all. Comics you never thought you'd live to see. A month-long event featuring a 4-issue miniseries by Grant Morrison, Val Meeks, and Prentice Rollins on sale in September. DC 1 Million." So September 1998, we had the core 4-issue miniseries spinning out of Grant Morrison's legendary JLA run. And then we also had every DC comic published that month displaying a 1 million issue, tying in with varying levels of depth and specificity to the overall storyline. Now, I have to issue a correction, and you might have caught this in earlier episodes. For some reason, I conflated, and I've been doing this for the length of this podcast, and even before this podcast, for years now, I have been conflating this type of crossover, which also includes things like Zero Hour, Final Night, Genesis, right, where we have a core weekly 4 or 5 issue miniseries, and then every book that month tying into it. I've been conflating that kind of miniseries with a 5th week event. And as I was rereading 1 Million today, for whatever reason, it dawned on me. I was like, oh, no, these are different things. So I just want to say, anytime that I've referred to one of these stories as a 5th week event, I retract that. 5th week events would be things like Sins of Youth, Tangent, Girl Frenzy, things like that, where we had this 5th week in the month and DC would put out these one-shots all under a similar banner. So I'm sorry, very sorry.
Well, to be fair, this one came out with a month that had 5 weeks, so that I believe, yeah, because the JLA issue happened right in the middle of it. Um, but yeah, that man, that was a weird time. Like every once in a while, you go to the comic shop and it's just nothing but girl frenzy books, which some of them are good. I mean, there New Year's Evil was another one that I remember from '97, I believe, because I was going into '98. So yeah,
Yes. So
you're
anyway,
just I just had a flood of like if you ever watched the show Highlander when he has a memory and he goes, that's just what happened to me. So I apologize.
no, all good. But as we get into 1 million, where does this fall for you? And I've seen some of your posts where you rank them, so I think I probably can answer this, but I toss it to you. Where does this kind of event fall for you within the hierarchy of these kinds of events, the Zero Hours and the Final Nights and the Genesis stories? Like where does 1 million land for you?
Oh, it's a top five, definitely. And I didn't really know that until a couple of years ago when another friend of mine was covering Green Lantern, and he had an episode all about DC 1 million, and it made me dig it out and read it again. And then I realized, wow, this is really one of the better ones they've put out. My favorite will always be Invasion, because that was the first one that I was. Well, technically, the first one I was a part of was Millennium, but no one wants to claim Millennium. Um, it's not the best. And the things it did to Lana Lang, that they just, at one point, I think they just, at one of those super summits, they just had a collective, like, we're not going to talk about this anymore. So, um, but yeah, Invasion's up there for me with Final Night and uh, Zero Hour and Armageddon 2001, which is a different type of crossover, but still a crossover. I don't put Crisis on the list because that's beyond the scope of this of such a list. I mean, because everyone's gonna just about everyone my age is gonna say Crisis, so I just put that to the side as its own goat. Um, but yeah, definitely top five. I love this story, and rereading it reminded me why I loved it so much.
It is particularly strong. I've always sort of looked back on it fondly. I certainly remember reading this as it was coming out, and I remembered it well, but I definitely came away from this reread with greater appreciation for it. There's a lot that I think really works well, and it's Morrison, so you have some crazy big ideas, and Superman's at the center of it. And we were messaging about this over Twitter, but just kind of keeping in mind the context of this story. So this was 1998. So we're in the 60th anniversary year of Superman. We have this big event where Superman and the future, the dynasty, the legacy of Superman, right, is core to this story. It's smack in the middle of Morrison's renowned JLA run, which we recently covered and is remains a favor. Is really my introduction to the Justice League, really. And within the context of the Triangle era, maybe this is where it gets a little dicey or a little, depending on your perspective, but right in the middle of two big Dominus storylines, spinning out of Superman Forever and then the King of the World story, one of which we've talked about, one of which we will talk about. So, I guess, again, just kind of an interesting spot that it occupies in the publishing history, right?
Yeah, and looking at it, it's like you kind of saw where they were going to go about a year or so later, um, especially with Mark Schultz writing two of the crossover issues. He was just a couple of months away from taking over Superman the Man of Steel as a writer and bringing in a more science fiction uh, take to that book. But yeah, it's funny. I have vivid memories of this coming out because it was just during that time period of my life where I was in my early 20s and hadn't met my wife yet, so I had a lot more time to myself. So going to the comic shop every week, picking up the latest batch, and I was reading a bunch of DC books at this time. Um, but yeah, it does land in this kind of weird period in Superman's existence because I remember being disappointed that they didn't do more in 1998 to celebrate the 60th anniversary. And that's fan entitlement. I'll cop to that because it's like they did this and Superman for All Seasons, and the first Dominus storyline was kind of a backdoor like celebration because they were doing different eras, but there wasn't a big, huge like anniversary issue like they did in the 50th. And it just seemed like DC was just like, okay, we're going to do some Superman stuff, but they were really shifting into getting more Batman centric around this time period as well. So I'm surprised the story got through. In all honesty,
That's fair. That's fair. And I have to say, in looking through that Wizard magazine around that Clark Kent article, it was just kind of interesting to see what else was going on in comics at the time. So, just in that issue, they have an interview with Kevin Smith about his Daredevil run, which was just getting going, and Batman No Man's Land we were at the outset of that. So, other things as well. But those were the Spider-Man relaunch, right? Where Howard Mackey took over both, all that business. So yeah, I mean, it's just interesting always to kind of think about what else was going on at the time around all of this. But I'm glad that we did get one of these big crossover events that Superman was at the center of.
yeah, and this was their mode. Once a year, they did a big event, and I have found that my interest in their events depend on how heavily Superman is involved. I mean, if you look at Genesis, which I'm sure you did, and I apologize, uh, you know, respect. Uh, there was only like two issues that crossed over with it. The others noped right out of it. Like we're not even going to touch it.
I'll be honest, when we did that episode, I did read the Superman issues that did tie in. I did not go back and reread the core miniseries. That was one of those ones I remembered enough from reading it initially, and I was like, nah, I'm okay, I'm good. But so don't give me too much credit. I didn't do all the homework that I could have. So DC 1 million, right? For anyone who is unfamiliar or needs a refresher, the setup for this is that the Justice League of the 853rd century, from the year 85,271, Justice Legion A, shows up in the present to invite the current day JLA to visit the future for the return of the prime Superman. He spent 100 centuries in the sun in his solar fortress of solitude, and now he's returning. So our JLA is going to go to the far future to participate in these challenges, to perform feats, all part of this celebration. And of course, as soon as our JLA gets to the future, they are mistaken for Bizarro duplicates and attacked, all a plot of Solaris, the tyrant son, who is aligned with Vandal Savage. And meanwhile, in the present, the future Hour Man unwittingly carried this virus back with him that's infected man and machine, just as the present day Vandal Savage is enacting this nuclear plot to take over the world. So, a lot of stuff going on, tying together the past and the far future. And of course, we get the 853rd century and that specific year. I guess Morrison crunched the numbers, and that's when the 1 millionth comic, DC comic would be published if we followed it all the way through, right? I guess that's the idea.
Yeah, I remember hearing the concept for it. Like, this is what the year would be if Action Comics got to 1 million, and I'm like, bold of you to think that there would be even comics in the 853rd century, but I mean, it's a good hook. DC, the 90s were a decade of gimmicks. You had Zero Month right after Zero Hour. So just to befuddle people who index comics, or as you well know, file comics in the back issue section of a comic shop. Um, now there's a 1 million issue to worry about. But what I liked about it is that it did have kind of a hook. Like, if you wanted to opt out of DC for the month, you could, and it wouldn't even screw up the numbering of your issues. But if you were following Morrison's JLA, which was that was a force of nature, in the late '90s, JLA as a brand was like, they had miniseries and specials and $6 prestige format books that had nothing to do with the main uh, the main series, but they'd slap that logo on it and I would buy it. So it did its job. But this, like you said, this is the halfway point, and I really just appreciated it on that level. Like, halfway through his run, he's referencing something that happened earlier in the Rock of Ages story, and now that's coming to fruition, while still also seeding things for the future, not only for the Justice League but for DC as well. There was one moment where I was just like, "Are they? That's like 3 months away. Are they talking about hyper time?" And yes, they were talking about hyper time, which I guess we'll have to explain at some point for those that weren't there and don't understand what the heck it was, because it didn't last very long. But no, I just love that for a month, basically DC said, "Okay, Grant, we're going to give you the line. Um, Everyone's gonna opt in," and I think, like you said, like, it was just about every title, from from Resurrection Man, who plays a very important part later in the series, to the Legion of Superheroes, which took place 1,000 years after this to confuse things even more. So it's, I guess, the after going through, and I'm not going to sit here and badmouth DC Comics from like 2004 up until like 2016 or even after that, but there was kind of a mean edge to the company and the way they approached their stories. And reading this, I forgot when it was just fun. Like like it was like, everything about this is just Grant Morrison having a grand old time doing what Grant Morrison does best. He did it in Final Crisis in 2008 or 9. He has like a story that makes a lot of sense, built around a concept that is much higher than that. So you have a virus that is taking over the earth, and you have Vandal Savage committing nuclear terrorism. But on top of that, you have a sentient sun who is trying to kill Superman, who's been living in the sun for 100 centuries. This is peak Grant Morrison to me.
For sure. And I've always said that this JLA era of Morrison is probably my favorite, because I think you do get all of those big, wild, crazy ideas filtered through a little bit more of a digestible superhero prism. My mileage has kind of varied on some of their other work, but At the same time, I've definitely come around on a lot more, especially over the course of doing this podcast and other shows as well. So I think my perspective on Morrison has expanded a little bit, but certainly going back to that time and even just the way I still look at their work generally, this really is the sweet spot where again you're getting those huge ideas, but again a little bit more I don't know, palatable or digestible. So yeah, I mean it's a lot of fun. One of the big picture things I wanted to ask you, because we talked about it on this podcast when we covered All Star Superman. We talked about how you can read All Star Superman and 1 Million as companions spiritually, if not in a strict continuity sense. And I gave my whole take then, so I don't need to rehash it. I want to get your take. This idea that, and look, we know they're all imaginary stories, and this is just one potential future and all of that. But in the context of this, the notion that our Superman lives into the 853rd century, and we get actually in that Man of Tomorrow issue by Mark Schultz in particular, we get a lot of backstory about what happened
Mhm.
between those two times. But the notion of our Superman outliving everyone and living that far into the future and living for 100 centuries in the sun. How do you feel about that sort of path and future for Superman?
So I'm kind of a meat and potatoes Superman guy. I really like when Superman is kind of the most fantastic thing in his world. And that is totally because when I started reading the Superman books, it was in the early days of the post crisis era. So, John Byrne was doing like big, huge superhero stories, but Wolfman was telling these kind of grounded, like, metropolis city stories, which just attracted me. And then as I grew older and read more, the Superman stories that I gravitate towards, like the early Golden Age era, the radio era, the first season of the George Reeves series, the post crisis, all of these are Superman stories where he's the biggest deal in the book. And I appreciate the inventiveness and the creativity that writers who are particularly inspired by the Silver Age, where literally anything could go. We're gonna have a story where Perry White smokes a cigar and it gives him superpowers. This seems like a legitimate story to tell, and there's a lot of fun to be had there. But when you're like dealing with a Superman that can count the grains of sand on Mars just by sitting in his room, like his apartment on 344 Clinton, that's where I'm just. It's not like I fall asleep. It's just where I start to kind of like the gravitational force weakens. So the idea of Superman living into the 853rd century, surviving inside of a sun, and then emerging from that is one of those things that I enjoy, and I cheat a little because I'm like, well, that's after all of the stories that I want to hear or I want to read about, or they're all done. So it's okay that, it's like it's so far in the future. I'm not going to live that long to see it happen. That might be a weird way to like, you know, bring it all in my head. Um, but it's one of those things I appreciate. It's just not my prefer way. It's not my preferred Superman stories. Now I'm starting to sound like the guy in that episode of Brave and the Bold. That's not my Batman, uh, which isn't what I'm trying to say.
No, but I hear you, and that's the thing. I land in the same place as well. I think it's a really cool idea, and I think especially for a Morrison story, where Morrison really looked at these characters as living myths, right? As gods among men. There's something that tracks, right? That this is what becomes of the character. But it's, as I said in that other episode, there's something so profoundly sad to me, right? About my favorite character carrying out that kind of existence. That's why I will always gravitate to whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Regardless of what issues people might have with that story, where it leaves the character, to me, it feels right in a way where this just makes me sad that he's, just enduring this lonely existence for a crazy amount of time. It's like just an insane amount of time. And we have a very hopeful finish. and a reunion with Lois and the birth of New Krypton at the end. It's a very hopeful finish, but that time in between, I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, let alone my favorite character. So I think it's, again, it's cool as an idea. It's cool as a potential, but there's no part of me as a fan that would ever kind of say, "Oh, I really like that's what I see when I envision the future of Superman."
I every once in a while I listen. I hear people talking about Superman as a character, not just talking about his stories or whatever. And it's usually around the issue of the Kents being alive or not alive, which I don't know if you know this, Anthony. Superman fandom can be divisive.
You don't
Um,
say.
yeah, it's I'm still suffering from wounds from the Civil War from 2013. Um, but there's this thing that people who are like really big fans of the character are like, well, I just like, the loneliness he feels. And that always strikes me as just like, I'm like, okay, on a level that humanizes the character, because then you're bringing Superman down to us. You're taking him away from being an aspirational figure, and you're acknowledging the fact that there is a certain sadness around him, not only in losing, his entire world, but then losing his parents. And I just listened to that. I'm like, why would you want him to be lonely? I mean, I know, I know it's a fictional character, but at the same time, I don't like the idea of Superman being like this solitary figure, because when you have him in that mode, you're it's almost like you're torturing him for no reason. You're not allowing him to have an existence that is somewhat normal. It's like, why, when they revealed the identity, for example, I was just like, well, where's he gonna go? I mean, at the very least, Clark Kent allows him to go get a Danish if he wants to go get a Danish without being mobbed. So I, I I'm I, it, we're I have found that you and I are simpatico, to use a really pretentious term, on a lot of things with Superman, and this seems to be one of the big ones where we're both like, why would anybody want him to be sad or lonely? That doesn't track with me.
Well, that's the thing, and I guess what I would also point to is that I guess I feel like there's enough sadness or loneliness already baked into the character. He lost a world he'll never know. He has this side of himself that he can't share, so there's always something that he kind of has to hold back. That, I guess, that to me is enough, and that provides enough of an avenue to be able to say, oh, you identify with whatever the case may be, to then say, oh well, we're also going to kill off the people who raised him, or we're going to do away with the secret identity. It's just like, nah, like that's a bridge too far for me, and I feel like it's just unnecessary. So that's sort of another component to it as well, where it's like there's enough already there where it's not like he's suffering per se, but that he's been through enough, and there's enough that he's wrestling with, that we can sort of sink our teeth into from a dramatic perspective. So yeah, I look, at the same time, as I always say, especially for fans of 1 million, for people who are like, no, like I love that notion. It's like, that's great. I don't begrudge anyone that, but yeah, it's not anything I would ever wish for the character. So
Yeah, I picked up a saying from a friend years ago. I don't want to yuck anybody's yum.
yeah.
Um, and at the same time, we're talking about concepts that ultimately matter, but they don't impact like your ability to live. So this is one of those times where I can actually say we can agree to disagree, and it's fine. Superman has been around for 80 plus years. You are never gonna. I always joke from the pilot episode of The Greatest American Hero, where Bill Maxwell tells Ralph Hinckley, "We couldn't agree on how to make Kool-Aid." And if you get five random Superman fans in a room, you're going to get five wildly different opinions about that character. They may like come together on some things, but there's always it's what I call the Kryptonian bridge too far. Like, some people are like, I like this but I don't like that, or I like this but when it gets to this point, that's where I tap out and I'm just going to hang out here. So, and it's all valid. That's the great thing. That's the amazing thing about these arguments, is at the end of the day, everybody's right.
It's yeah, no, very, very, very true. Something that all fans I think should always keep in mind. We all bring our own baggage, our own perspective. It's all good. One thing though that I really did appreciate in this event is that Superman himself, I think, expresses a lot of the misgivings or issues that we have. Right, he expresses it as well. He says like his initial reaction right when Justice Legion A shows up, he's like, I'm alive in the 853rd century.
Yes.
And when we
I
get to
love
the
that was his initial reaction. Like, I don't even know if I want to know this. It's just such a great human reaction to such a concept.
I mean, in all honesty, that's probably a thread that would have been worth exploring even more, in the months to
Mhm.
come. I know they had other fish to fry and all that, but that's again insane, and especially for this era of Superman, the more grounded human version of the character. This notion that I'm alive in 85,271 would be mind-boggling. And I love when we get to the to the wrap up of the story where he doesn't want to meet Superman Prime. Right? He tells the Superman of the Justice Legion A, he's like, I'm gonna go, like, he'll understand. Right? Like that's not even something that he wants to entertain. And he expresses to Jean at the very end, like, I don't know how I feel about this. I think Jean is like, well, you get used to it and it's only one potential future. And like, he kind of tries to put him at ease. I feel like there's more that could have been done there, but I did appreciate Superman's reaction to all of this, and I think it sort of gives some credence to what we're saying, the misgivings that we have from the fan perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of this event for Superman is that he had 5 titles. So you could explore not only the Superman of the present, but the Superman of the Justice Legion A and what he was going through, and seeing him meet Lois and seeing him like meeting Lex Luthor and just completely trusting him because in his era, because of the of one of the dynasties as they call them, Luthor and Superman are now friends, and there is no enemy. So when he gets kind of double crossed, it's almost like worse for him because he's used to working with this guy's descendants. And then you see Superman in the future. At first, just like, okay, I'm just going to play these games and then I'm just going to go home. This is a big party. I get it. And when the crowd turns on him, and talk about being prescient of Morrison introducing the idea that if you use what is essentially social media to sow seeds of doubt, it creates chaos. I was just like, this is perfect. This like this sings now in a way that I don't think it did in 1998.
Oh, 1,000%. I was thinking the same thing, right? Because Solaris is able to corrupt the headnet, this telepathic news network, right, and just kind of bombard people with all of these sound bites, and just twist their perception of what's happening, and make it seem like Superman and the rest of his counterparts from the JLA are these bizarro duplicate imposters. And yeah, definitely. Just I feel like in terms of yeah, social media and just of media generally, like just the dangers of all of that. Yeah, this tapped into a lot. I'm with you. It definitely. I mean, a being older now, but also just what we've been living through. Yeah, this hit a lot, a lot more powerfully now than it did when I was, a kid reading this in the late '90s. It's like I read it now and it's like, yeah, there's really something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I was barely on the internet at this time, because there was a time where you made that choice. Um, and it was right around this era that I started like going online and finding Superman websites and finding out that I was wrong, which was an interesting experience. Uh, so it definitely didn't hit me then. It didn't hit me the last time I read it. But like you said, with everything we've been through, art is interesting in that way, where it can kind of mean different things depending on the what is going on societally, just in general. Uh, I just loved seeing how both Superman dealt with being in different eras. Because one of the cool things about the Superman of Justice Legion A, which is a mouthful, um, is that he was also losing his powers throughout the course of the story, which I think ramped up the drama of his end of it. And reading it this time, I appreciated him more. I used to not really like the character all that much, especially when they were bringing him back. Um, and I think any Smallville fan will appreciate his S symbol on his chest. So that might hit a different generation. But I just really liked watching him have to fight just in such a backwards era, losing everything that he is used to being able to tap into. And yeah, if you look at the timeline between the book, the main book, and the crossovers, it doesn't quite line up. But you're never going to have that 100%. So that I kind of let go. But yeah, I just loved watching him fight his way back to the past, so that when he got or to the future, so that when he got there and he was like powered up again, it was like a fist pumping moment. Like, oh, this is one of the big moments that Morrison was leading to, and it paid off just beautifully.
Yeah, it was really cool when you get to the point where he is trying to punch his way through the time barrier, right? There's this, time travel device that Steele was working on, didn't get all the way there, and he's trying to get through and get back to the future. And he's sending these shockwaves throughout time, and he's getting older and weaker, and he's just basically at the end here, at the end of his rope. And like you said, then he makes it, and it is that fist pumping moment. It really, I thought it played really well. So that definitely was effective. And I echo what you said, the fact that we had 5 Superman titles. So for this episode, we reread the core 4-issue miniseries as well as the issue of JLA 1 Million and the 5 Superman titles. I did, per our exchange, I did also at least skim through the Supergirl, Young Justice, and Superboy issues as well. To this day, I've still never read every single 1 million tie-in. Have you? Have you ever done the full deep
No,
dive
I've,
into
I've
it?
never. That is going to happen because we've planned on covering DC 1 Million. Like around the time this episode's coming out, we might be in the middle of our final night coverage, which is what we also did with Zero Hour, where we cover the main book, the Superman book, and then just talk about the other crossovers. This one's going to be more reading because there's just so many of them. But I have never sat down and read every single one. I have read all. At the time, I was collecting Batman, the 3 Batman titles, Robin, Nightwing. I was basically, if you were a JLA member, I was collecting your title. So I read them back then, and I have like zero memory of most of them at this point because it's been 25 years almost. So that's, I've got a good memory. It's not Mark Wade level, so I can't claim that.
No, I hear you. I have to say I did struggle a little bit with the correct reading order. So I used to own the single issues, and I since sold those. So I was reading on the DC app, and they have it listed in 2 different ways, as a storyline and as a series. And I think the series order tracked better. So I would probably recommend that. But there are sites out there that will give you a more specific breakdown, and you can see how things line up. But then there are certainly issues. I think Supergirl probably is a good example that really don't have any bear. You could kind of read that wherever or skip it, and others that do tie in more specifically.
Yeah, the Young Justice and Supergirl were both written by Peter David, and one of the things about Peter David's writing career is that, especially in the 90s, he was constantly getting screwed over by crossovers. He would be getting a storyline started, and then he would have to participate in whatever big thing was coming that year. So I felt like his Young Justice story was him kind of poking fun at crossovers in general, because each of the Superboy, the Robin, um, and the impulse of the 853 third century was telling their version of a crossover event from their character's perspective. And it's kind of a Rashomon thing where they're making their character the most important. And he also snuck in some weird references. Robin, the Robin of the future, talks about what a great ice skater Robin was. And I don't know if this was for a fact, but Burt Ward was a championship ice skater when he was a kid, before he grew up to be Robin on television. So I don't know if that was like Peter David's like cheeky, like deep cut Easter egg. And the Supergirl one, has nothing to do with DC 1 million. It's just this crazy. I don't know if it's because he had a bunch of daughters and he was just tapping into the fact that little girls can come sometimes be kind of like little kids in general can just be like destructive. And Superboy, I actually was really impressed with Carl Kessel's ability to participate in the crossover, but keep all of the story beats from his run on Superboy at the time going as well. So they're not necessary, but they're fun. So if you're doing like a big grand read, yeah, put them in. My reading order was, and I found this is true with most of the crossovers. You read the first issue, and then always read the Superman issue that came out that week before the main book, the main crossover book. And usually that doesn't steer you wrong in terms of a chronology.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And yeah, that Superboy issue actually was a stand. Like the Young Justice one was fun, and I have a lot of affinity and affection for that Young Justice series. I enjoyed that a lot when it was coming out. I'm so overdue for a reread of the entire thing. We'll get there eventually. But that one was a lot of fun for all the reasons that you laid out. And yeah, the Superboy one, I did think that the structure of it was really cool and a nice way to participate in the crossover while still maintaining the integrity of the stories that you've been telling, because they find the frozen body of Jim Harper, the Guardian, in the 853rd century. And then through the 1 million version of Double X are able to kind of see the last things that he had seen in our present day. And so you get our time in the 1 million world, but also our time in the present day. And I thought that was a cool, yeah, that was a cool balance. The structure of that was really neat.
And Kessel at that point was really tapping into Kirby concepts. Like when he came back to Superboy, uh, not too long before this, he basically made Superboy Commandy, and then he drops him straight into Cadmus, which is, I think, something that character needed at the time. So you have all of these crazy Kirby concepts uh, written by somebody that loves the king and an artist that is able to bring those to life. I mean, Superboy 1 million looks like Omac. That he's got the mohawk and everything. So it was just like one of those things where all of this just makes perfect sense. And it seemed to me from looking at the material that the creators were having fun with it instead of, this is like a slog to get through for them.
Yes. No, well, I agree with that. And, among those five Superman titles, we get a couple of issues following the future Superman in the present, right? As he's trying to stop Vandal Savage's nuclear attack against Metropolis, right? He's gotten the jump on the Titans characters and placed them inside these decommissioned Rocket Red war suits, and has sent them to various targets. And then we also have, I mean, I think, the Superman issues in particular really do tie in very specifically to the ongoing story where the future Superman realizes that uh, the only way to defeat this virus in the present day is to create Solaris, the villain that is ultimately responsible for all of this. So, which I thought that was a cool twist on the proceedings, and a great plan, right? For the villain to have like all of this is to ensure that it is ultimately created to exist and enact this plan in the first place. So I thought that was neat. And then the fact that one of the things that the Superman asks for is a human DNA sample, right? And Lois gives her blood, and then of course in the far future, Green Lantern Kyle Rayner will have to retrieve that DNA sample, and that will be part of what's used to recreate Lois for Superman Prime. So, you get a lot of those little pieces along the way. So, reading the Superman books at a minimum, in conjunction with the main miniseries, is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and the main miniseries itself was Morrison ratcheted up to 11. Um, there is like an over the top nature to everything about this. But at the same time, it doesn't come at the expense of character. So when they introduce the Titans, for example, and it's not really a real version of the Titans because this is shortly before they did the JLA Titans miniseries, which led into the Devin Grayson series. Um, Morrison's kind of mean to these characters and how other characters are talking about them. Um, but it's just having them be like the start of the threat to the present, and Vandal Savage being part of it. Vandal Savage is one of my favorite villains of the DC universe. I kind of prefer him not to be a cannibal, but different strokes and all that. So the fact that he was a part of this, not only in the present but in the future, and like you said, the little things that Morrison would do through the course of the story, like in the future, he's got an eye patch. Well, why does he have an eye patch? Well, it's because right during one of the big fights, he loses an eye. And I don't know if you've ever read Justice League Task Force, which was a very '90s title, I might add. During towards the end of that run, Christopher Priest took it over and made it like the Justice League training team. They all had jackets because it was 1995, and he brings in Vandal Savage. And it was reading those issues that made me excited to see him here, because that Vandal Savage was in that story was tracking down his descendants so that he could have organs to replace the ones of his that have failed. And it's just like, well, that's an interesting high concept. So here we have a Vandal Savage that is very much the I'm an immortal and I'm better than you, which is, I think, a Morrison staple. He's really good at writing obnoxiously smart people. Uh, Him and Mark Miller both have that tick. It's kind of interesting. But I just loved seeing it. And then, starting it on day 3 in the first issue, and then immediately going back a couple days, it's like, well, what the heck is going on with John Jones? And then you realize they've just nuked a city in the DC universe.
Yeah,
Like,
Montevideo, yeah, gets wiped off the face of the planet. And you know what's funny? Going in, not funny, but going into this, for my memory was playing tricks on me, and I thought that through some time travel machinations, it was saved by the end of it. I thought this was going to be undone, but it's not. I mean, the twist at the end, right, is that the future Vandal Savage is transported there, right, as the nuke hits, but it still hits. So yeah,
yeah, no,
high stakes here.
and I think that's also why, it's like double jeopardy Superman. Even with your great, speed, you can't catch two missiles. Not only are we dealing with a virus that is attacking both humans and machines and making you more violent and not as rational, but you're also dealing with the fact that there's a nuclear terrorist threatening the rest of the world with what they think are missiles, but are actually rocket red armor. So it's just like, the great thing about this crossover is it's so steeped into the DC universe. Like, he plays with a lot of different toys that he doesn't usually get to play with the Justice League. And the Justice League issue was great because everyone was over the top. Like, everyone was yelling. And then you have that great moment right at the end where the Batman of the 853rd century turns around, points at the reader, and goes, I accuse you of being a traitor. I'm just like, this is so great. I love this so much. This is making me so happy.
Yeah, it's look in typical Morrison fashion. I mean, it's busy. Like there's a lot. It's very kinetic. There's a lot going on. We have the small group of leaguers on the Watchtower who were not on Earth, so we're thus not exposed to this virus, and they're trying to build a time machine and figure out what's going on. And I really liked, and of course the Superman fan here really liked that Steel was stepping up and assuming a leadership position. We get this exchange in that JLA 1 million issue where Steel is like, I have to get back home, right, to protect my niece. And Plastic Man is like, you can't go. The one black man on the team can't quit. And John Henry is like, listen, when I signed up, like I wasn't signing up to be the sole representative, in that capacity. But just to see that character getting some play, and Huntress, Huntress is the one who comes up with this whole idea of embedding John Jones on Mars to kind of pay off all the way in the future, which I don't know how does the time travel logic of all of this work?
Um, right before I answer that, I do want to point out that one of the things I noticed the last time I read this that I loved is that Morrison basically gave us a trinity, a replacement trinity. With Big Barda, Steel, and Huntress, you have a Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman dynamic. Um, and I don't know if that was his intention. That is just what I took from the art. And like you, Steel is my favorite of the reign of the Superman characters. So seeing him getting, and let's be fair, he has not gotten the best deal most of the time in comics.
Nope.
So this was one of those few times where it's like, oh, okay, we're going to treat him with, yeah. The time travel thing is so, it's, everything has to work out just right. There is no margin for error on this. So he thinks that this thing buried on Mars was a piece of kryptonite, but it's not. It's a basically the makings of a Green Lantern ring, leading to a brilliant moment where you see the sun and a Green Lantern symbol in the middle of it, and it's just like, and John had to be on Mars. If he wasn't on Mars in the future, none of this works. And as somebody that was reading The Martian Manhunter at the time, this was extremely frustrating because he had a zero issue, the million issue before his first issue. Only in the 90s could this happen. Um, but yeah, a lot of it doesn't track if you look at it too deeply. Like if you're sitting here with like a piece of paper and a pencil and you're trying to like write everything out, don't. Just kind of go with it, because if you look at it too much, it does seem like, okay, this isn't relying on coincidence. This is relying on a plan happening in an exact sequence of events that if anything falls out of place, the day is lost essentially.
Yes. One thing I've learned with Morrison, yeah, is not to get too hung up on the particulars and just kind of go along for the ride. And I did not read the Martian Manhunter 1 million issue. Maybe this was explained, or maybe I just missed something generally. But if the idea is that, and not to harp on this, but like if the idea is that he's lying dormant on Mars, right, to be there in the future, it's like, well, but then is he not there in the present? Like that's what I'm getting a little tripped up on. But it's okay. It's a cool
What
payoff.
what we're assuming is that at some point, John just, after all the adventures we're going to see him in the next couple of years, John just leaves Earth and goes back to Mars and just chills for hundreds of centuries.
I suppose. Also, on the note of Vandal Savage, the timing of this is interesting because we very recently covered a selection of Justice League and Justice League Unlimited episodes continuing threads from Superman the Animated Series. And so, of course, we had to take a look at the Hereafter two-parter, where Superman is presumed dead, but is actually in the far future, where the Earth is this wasteland under a red sun, and it's all the inadvertent work of Vandal Savage, and you get this like crazy, unexpected, very enjoyable two-hander with Superman and Vandal Savage, and they have to work together. So it was just kind of interesting to go from that very recently to this story here. I got certainly, again, a more traditional version of the character, but in my head, in terms of what I had just seen of Vandal Savage, it's like, no, like he's a friend, different version.
He's crazy.
Yeah.
He's gone crazy being the only person on Earth. I mean, that moment where he's like, perhaps I killed him over here. No, no, it was over here. You want to get lunch? It's just like, okay, man, I get it. You're getting too close. Personal space, Vandal. Personal space. And Vandal Savage is one of those characters that you can do this type of story with. I feel like Morrison was really brilliant in selecting him to be the villain in the past and the villain in the future, and having him hate the wine in the present, but in the future he appreciates it more because he's learned to appreciate things more. It's just like, again, Morrison is really good at just little bits of character that just make you glom on to the characters and appreciate them more within the story he's telling. Like, this is high stakes. This is, everything is on the line, and we're gonna have the Atom and Oracle flirting, as he's going through her body so that he can deconstruct what the
Virus.
virus. What did they? Why am I blanking on what the virus was called? Uh,
Oh, did it
it,
have the Hourman
I thought
virus?
it
What did
had
it
a
have?
name. Maybe I'm just giving Morrison a lot of credit that he probably came up with a weird name. Um, but yeah, seeing, like, him again, reminding me of an episode of Justice League Unlimited where he goes uh, break down into the self-replicating machines. Um, so now I'm hung up on the fact that I thought that there was a name, and I'm just like that's where my brain is focused on right now. I'm sorry, I'm a little.
If
I'm
there
trying to come back.
if there is, I'm blanking on it. I really think they just kept referring to it as the Hourman virus or just
The
the
Hour Man,
virus.
that yeah, and Hour Man, for a character that's kind of central to everything, they don't really give him much to do.
No, he's yeah, I know. Certainly in the beginning, but once that virus is deployed and you see him dealing with the guilt of being the unwitting carrier of this, there's really not much until the end. So I don't know, man. And it's interesting too because you have, of course, our JLA in the future, perceived as these bizarro duplicates and hunted, and then in the present you have the public distrusting Justice Legion A because, of course, right after our JLA goes away, this virus infects every man and machine on the planet. Um, and ultimately they did bring it here, though it wasn't their intention. So, you have both teams in both eras, sort of hunted and distrusted. And of course, they're eventually able to overcome that. But, dealing with a very similar threat in both respects. And I guess, too, like the structure of all of this, yeah, in that main miniseries, we are really, for the most part, in the present. It's really when you get into all of those crossovers or the tie-ins, where you get to see more of this 1 million world, this 853rd century. And, we're going back to this idea just of some of the tie-ins. I mean, I didn't reread this for this, but I remember the Green Arrow 1 million issue. That was the last issue of the series. Like, I think 137 was ostensibly the last issue of that Chuck Dixon written
Hmm.
series. And then they had a 1 million issue, and it is what it is, and they have to sell comics, but it's like, really? It's like your series is done, and it's like, well, tack on a 1 million issue.
Hey, they got to sell. Everyone's got to participate. Participation is mandatory. It's just, and some of them, like I just for grins, I read the Starman 1 million issue. Which if you've never read James Robinson's Starman, I would advise it. It's a great series. But what I loved is him being a traitor played into it because he meets his progenitor, essentially. He meets Ted Knight, and he can't lie to him. And at the end, he's just like, I'm just a failure. I didn't even want this. And he flies off so that when he participates and makes the ultimate sacrifice play at the end, it just has so much more gravitas. This is one of those, I will say, that you can. The only one that is absolutely essential is you have to read JLA 1 million in the middle of it. If you don't read that, you're gonna get to issue 3 and you're gonna be kind of lost. And when they originally released like JLA trade paperbacks, like the issue before this is where that trade paperback ended. They had JLA DC 1 million, and then they picked it up again. And so you kind of have to read it, and it's a really good issue. So that kind of helps. You got Howard Porter drawing it, which I thought was interesting because he and Val Semex had kind of a similar style. Like everyone is extremely broad shouldered with these artists. It's not a bad thing. I liked both, um, but I think in terms of having uh, an artist where it's not too much of a disconnect when you get from one story to another. I thought that was smart. It's like reading some of the Superman ones. The art was kind of all over the place uh, in terms of it. I felt kind of bad because the issue where they go through the Superman dynasty, I felt had the weakest art of the crossovers. And I'm like, this is the one where you needed to stick the landing on every single page because you're showing all these different versions of Superman through the eras. That was like the only complaint I had, though. Oddly enough, so I guess if that's my only complaint, this whole event has a lot going for it.
Yes, no, for sure. That was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you because tying back to what you were saying before, where if you really wanted to sit out this month of DC Comics, you could, and even as a Superman reader following the ongoing Triangle era adventures, you really could, because with one exception, right, all of the issues, the Superman tie-in issues, are written by either Mark Schultz or Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, right? That writing team. What did you make of the fact that we didn't? Because this was a departure, right, from what we would typically get from one of these crossover tie-in months, where for the most part, we did not have our regular Superman creative teams doing the tie-in books.
So 1998, Mike was a little annoyed because I wanted the regular creative teams. 2023, Mike is realizing that this is the end of that era. So you have more of this, because I don't know if it's the next month or the month afterwards, but there's for 2 years in 98, 99, they both had like a month of stories written by Ron Mars, which was like a 4-part story that had nothing to do with anything going on in the titles. So I guess this was just, and maybe I should have taken that at the time as, oh, this era is really coming to an end, and they're just doing other things to kind of. It's not like they were doing it on purpose to prep us. Uh, what I found in reading them this time is that I really liked that Kessel and Ordway got to work together on one of the issues. But if you're gonna do a really big sci-fi story, Mark Schultz and Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning are two people you want to go to. Like, if you love the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, it's because of Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning reinvigorating those characters during Annihilation that gave us that. So anytime I get to see them play in kind of a cosmic playground, I like it. And Mark Schultz really brought a freshness to the Superman books in exploring the more science fiction um, elements of his character, especially when Eddie Berganza took over as editor. He was the sci-fi guy. That's where they looked at the Krypton stuff, which had not historically been a big part of the post-crisis Superman. It's just like he wanted to have some connection to it, but he was okay leaving that, like in the fortress in the Arctic, and he can go play with that when he wants to. So I but yeah, in the past when it happened, I was annoyed because I wanted to see what Dan Jurgens was going to do with a future Superman, or I think I didn't look at the timeline. We're almost at the point where Wheezy and Boggs are off the title,
We're
and
getting
we have
very
a
close to
bunch of,
that.
and then there's a bunch of fill-in issues after that. Uh, so yeah, it. I felt it worked for the story, but part of me is a little disappointed that I didn't get to see, the regulars get a chance to take a crack at this.
Now I feel the same, and yeah, you're right. I believe the Ron Mars four-parter this year was the Candor. There was a Candor arc, and then the following year it's the one man JLA
Hmm.
story where he took over the books for the month. So yeah, I mean, and we really are, and that's what we'll be covering in the remainder of this Electric Till 1 Million event. I mean, really not the end of the Triangle era, but the end of the Triangle era as we knew it. The Dan Jurgens led period within this. And so yeah, we are winding down. And I think there might be something to to what you said, where maybe that accounts for why, they didn't participate in this the way they had in the prior ones. But I agree. I think the the writers in question we're talking about, did a great job and were a great fit for these kinds of stories. Um, is there, you mentioned how we get this insight into what became of Superman and the Superman dynasty and the alliance between the House of El and the Luthers. We know that at one point there's a marriage between Superman and a member of the fifth dimension, and that introduces all of these new senses and powers and things like that. Is there anything in terms of kind of what we find out about Superman and the Superman dynasty? Is there anything else that really stood out to you, and or anything that wasn't addressed that you're like, oh man, it would have been cool to know whatever happened with X?
Nothing that I felt was left out. I just loved that eventually he just marries into his villains. Um, and Mixie, depending on your perception of Mixie, he's either a villain or he's just an imp that is just there to sow chaos. I think he works better that way. So I when it said he married the person from the fifth dimension, I'm like, wow, that's an open minded member of the Superman family, where he's just looking at that and going, yeah, that's what I want. And it's one of those ways of introducing like the mega powers. And again, we were talking earlier where once it got way beyond my comfort zone. However, because it's actually two things. One, it's all in the future, so it doesn't matter. And two, we've been through 15 reboots since we started this episode. So I really feel like any era of Superman now can be enjoyed, because it's not that it doesn't matter, but the continuity isn't important anymore. So you take the eras as they are instead of, oh, this is supposed to be the continuing adventures of Superman. So this was, I think, the breaking point where DC as a company wanted to move beyond what had been done with the post crisis era. And it's kind of funny, we're going to be talking about that article, but we're really winding down. And as much as I would have loved to have these guys on the series, forever and ever and ever, that's just not how things work out. So I realize I went beyond your question. I apologize for that. I went on a bit of a tangent there. Um, but no, the two things that stood out was the mixing with the Luthers and the marrying the fifth dimension person. I'm also just I was also just fascinated at how some that they mentioned seem to just die very quickly. Like, and that's an option for future Superman. Uh, I More than anything, though, I think the scope of that issue was way beyond what one issue. Like, they needed more room for that. the,
Yes, you know what? That's a very good point. And I was thinking about this too, because that Man of Tomorrow issue is this massive info dump that
yeah,
comes really, it's the final week of this month-long crossover event, and it packs so much in where and because I had revisited this briefly in preparation for the All-Star Superman issue that I did. I was like, okay, I want to get some of the main beats of the 1 million story. And so when I was rereading All-Star, I also read 1 million 1 through 4, and then I was skimming through the Superman issues. And I remember getting to that Man of Tomorrow thing, and again, I had read it when it came out, but I didn't remember it. And I was going through it and I was like, "Oh, wait, like this is big." Like this lays out the entire timeline of events. So yes, I feel like that probably should have come earlier. It's, in all honesty, as much as I enjoyed, over those 5 Superman tie-ins, we spent a couple issues with, again, Justice Legion, a Superman in the present and our Superman in the future. But really, like everything that we get in that Man of Tomorrow issue, that should have probably been the Superman issues.
and I love that they, in a narrative sense, they're like, okay, it's almost like explain this to me like I'm a 5-year old.
Yeah.
It's just like, tell it as a story so that Superman will understand it.
It's like Michael Scott on The Office when he doesn't understand what a surplus is and he asks Oscar.
And that's the kind of the beauty of that issue, is that it's almost like, and I don't know if you had this, because I know last year you went through the John Byrne run, and Byrne had this thing, and it's something that Jeffrey and I noticed as we were reading it that I didn't notice at the first time. He would drop like 16 pages of exposition on the last page. Like most of the issues ended with Superman telling you what happened, and that's kind of what this felt like. Like this was a giant John Byrne info dump right at the end, where it's just like, oh crap, we didn't explain any of this. We just said that there was a lineage, but we haven't really talked about it. Okay, Schultz, go.
Yeah, it's very true, and sort of I don't disagree with that analogy, and then the sort of the framing device. He has Platinum from the Metal Men
Hmm.
sort of give this oral history, and sort of the ultimate reason for it is that Solaris is interfering with Superman's ability to teleport because he needs to reunite with the rest of the JLA in the 853rd century. And so, what we find out eventually is that Superman's plan was to kind of use this to goad Solaris to kind of play into his ego and jealousy and get him to relent and have this final showdown. And so you get, and Platinum gets a lot of play in this. And the Metal Men generally, we a lot of Metal Men. I'm not the biggest Metal Men fan, so that didn't do a lot for me, I have to say.
No, they were part of early Action Comics during the era when I started reading. I remember Action 599 not really understanding because I had not gotten 590 yet. So I'm just like, why is this important? Yeah, the Middlemen are one of those concepts where I'm like, you have to be of a certain generation and a certain mindset to enjoy this. And not only that, it's not only the Metal Men, it's the Metal Men as conceived by Mike Carlin and Dan Jurgens for that miniseries from like 1994, where Doc Magnus became Viridium.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is one of those things where I pity people who are more contemporary or just didn't read it at the time, going back and reading it with zero context about what's going on. It's like when people read Death of Superman. Why does Supergirl turn into pink goo in the middle of this story? There is absolutely no explanation of that anywhere if you're just reading that trade paperback.
Listen, 5-year-old Anthony had no idea what that was. And he learned later, but at the time, it's like, oh, I guess that's just what Supergirl does.
Yeah,
And I
I had
guess,
a friend. I had a friend read Death of Superman back in 2012, and she's like, "I'm going to have you on standby." I'm like, "That's fine," and I was waiting for it. I was waiting for it, and then one time, beep, look down. Why is Supergirl pink goo? I was like, "Here we go.
I think
This
if
is what I was waiting for."
I think if you're young enough, like I was young enough where I wasn't really going to question it. Again, I think in my young mind it was probably just like, well, that's Supergirl. But yeah, if you're thinking about it to any extent, it's like, yeah, it makes no sense. So and now obviously with the ability to look things up is we have that, we can check anything, but still, especially at this time, it's like, yeah, you were just kind of plopped into it. But like we were saying, in the opening part of this 1 million event, there is this tidbit that Superman traveled to stars, right? After for a period of time before taking up residence in his Fortress of Solitude in the sun. But it isn't until this Man of Tomorrow issue, unless there's some other tie-in that gives us more, but I doubt it. It's only when you get to this Man of Tomorrow tie-in that, you see this, or at least get some hints into this journey that he had. And when he comes back, they describe him as the Ishmael who's returned, and he's got
Hmm.
these white eyes and his costume's torn, and he's just a haunted shell of a man. And that further feeds into what we were saying before, like why I hate this future for the character, because again, it's not like he comes back and he's like, you know, it's sad that I lost the life I had built here, but I found a new one, or whatever the case may be. I mean, this is like a broken man who floats on down before he goes to the fortress in the sun. So this is a key issue for sure.
Yeah, I remember seeing that when I read that issue the other night. I was just like, I forgot that he came back as like this changed person, where only going into the sun is going to be where I mean, everybody, if you're feeling kind of down and out, maybe going to the beach, getting some sun will make you feel better. I guess there's not a lot of vitamin D in the universe, but yeah, that's just such a tragic thing. I mean, and again, like you said before, he gets a happy ending. There's always the happy ending, even in All Star Superman, where ostensibly he dies at the end. You know what's coming, so it's more of a, okay, this is for right now, but eventually. And the fact that you have that random, like, I need a DNA sample, and then they recreate Lois, and then they recreate Krypton, and it's like he gets everything he wants. And it's one of those times where a writer has given Superman an end, but it's not depressing. I mean,
Yeah.
getting there may have been a little depressing, but he gets to have everything he wants at the end, and then there's no telling what happened after Superman came back and the Kryptonians were reborn. It was really interesting. I keep forgetting, like, nowadays where Kryptonian clothing is either like people want to reference Superman the movie or they want to go in like a complete different sci-fi direction. I forgot. Oh yeah, there was a point where it was only the John Byrne stuff.
I know. I was thinking that too because again, I'm jumping around here, so I'm definitely seeing different versions of Kryptonian garb, and then you see this, and it's like, no, yeah, we're still firmly in this era. I really did like how we saw those events through the eyes of Kyle Rayner as he's
Hmm.
sharing everything with Jean, and kind of going back to what you were saying before about Morrison's treatment of various characters, but I think you especially see this with Kyle and with Wally in Morrison's JLA run. Really building them up as characters, and when Kyle's the one who has to create and contain this supernova, and Batman's guiding him, and it's like he's struggling, right? He doesn't know if he could do it, and Batman believes in him. He gives him that push, and then of course, future Superman shows up to lend a hand. But I love the role that he plays, and as Kyle is sharing everything that he saw, it's just this sense of grandeur and wonder and disbelief, like he's just kind of in shell shock over what he's experienced naturally. But I think it gives the proceedings such weight as he's talking about future Superman, where he's like, this guy, like he's been on adventures we can't imagine. And then of course we get the wink, right? The final
Yep,
Superman
right
story has
there at the
always got
end.
to end with the wink as the golden Superman Prime turns and gives that wink. I got chills as I was reading it. It's like I said, not my preferred ending for the character, but I like it, and it were again like it conjured a response in me. So there's something to be said for that.
Absolutely. And yeah, keying off really quick for something you said, what Morrison did when he did the JLA is that if you look at DC Comics through the course of the 90s, there was a period right after Zero Hour and right up until JLA where DC seemed to be wanting to embrace the more image style of the time period. Things were more violent. The art got kind of weird. Like even in the Superman books, you had Bloodthirst. Not the most memorable of Superman villains, but Bloodthirst and Bloodsport and High Tech. Uh, and it seemed like right around the time of Kingdom Come, and they talk about this. I don't know if you remember the comics at the time had this watch this space
Yep.
feature in every issue where they would kind of tell you like behind the scenes stuff that's going on. And at one point, they talk about the fact that it seemed like DC as a company said, you know what? We've got really good characters and we've got really good writers. We're going to lean into that. And it was like after Kingdom Come and then with JLA, it was like this renewed sense of just fun and optimism just in general with the entire universe. And with JLA, Grant Morrison's like, okay, you have the Magnificent Seven. So Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman and John have all been around for a while. So Wally and really Kyle are your entrance characters because Kyle's new to this. He's been part of teams, but he's never been with the big leagues. And so that's why at the end of the first JLA adventure, you have him going, looking at the watchtower on the moon and going, "Cool," because that's what you as the reader are supposed to be doing.
Yes. No, I agree totally. Before we do our wizard article lightning round, is there anything else about 1 million that we haven't hit on that you wanted to, or that we
No,
shouldn't?
yeah, we hit everything that I had kind of written down that occurred to me at the time. I just I think in terms of having time travel be a fun gimmick to use, having Vandal Savage be transported by Kronos uh, to where the nuke hits was just chef's kiss. Great way to end it. Like this guy thinks he's won, and it's just one final like fu from Resurrection Man and Kronos.
Yes. No, it was the perfect button to the story. Yeah, I mean, I obviously we didn't do a issue by issue breakdown, but I think we definitely hit on the key aspects of this. I will say it got it for. and this is a little nitpicky, but I feel like it was a little bit much at a certain point in reading these tie-ins. The number of characters, and I'm sure there were more in the tie-ins that we didn't read, where present day characters are still alive in the future, right? So it's like Platinum's still alive. They defrost Jim Harper Guardian. Uh, Resurrection Man is still, still. And again, it's not that it doesn't make sense, right? Like it tracks for those characters, but it's just at a certain point, it's like, how likely is it that Superman himself, of course, well, these people still alive in the 853rd century? But no, just a very, very. It was a fun story. It was definitely worth revisiting. I guess the last big thing that I wanted to mention and ask, how is it that we have not gotten like an animated movie adaptation of something like this?
That is kind of weird because Morrison's a popular creator, and this seems to be something that would lend itself to an animated feature of some sort. I mean, it. I don't know if. I mean, we've got All Star Superman, which I would argue more than this one does not lend itself to a movie because that's such
Agreed.
an episodic story. This has a beginning, middle, and an end. So, and it flows. And, if you have people that are buying into a Justice League, you're going to have people that are going to buy into a Justice League from the future. And, introducing a tyrant son, uh, which years ago when I helped my friend Stella cover this on her Batgirl podcast, we put a challenge out to have somebody like draw a cute version of Solaris, and they did. It was kind of adorable, but no, this would I would love to see like an animated film based on this, just because you could do such crazy things in the animation and really tell the story. Because while there's a lot going on, it's not a complicated plot.
Agreed. I know that's the thing. It's very busy, but when you boil it down, it's pretty simple and straightforward, right? And it's like once the present day team is able to build Solaris, right? The virus is dealt with. Starman sacrifices himself. Solaris is dealt with for the time being, and then we have to deal with reconnecting in the future. So maybe I'll tweet at James Gunn because he responds to everybody, it seems. So I'll just say, hey. Anyway, so this Wizard article, right? This piece that I've been referencing called "Clark Kent" by the Wizard staff. Which, listen, I can appreciate, wanting to offer some critique, some criticism, some assessment of the Superman books, but I also feel like, listen, put your names to it if you're going to, to do something like this. But it is what it is. This was the first issue of Wizard I ever bought. This article, it's definitely stuck with me over all these years, in part because it was the first one and it was speaking directly about the main books I was reading at the time. So like I remember flipping through this and it was like, it was my first experience with this magazine and with this kind of, again, in a pre-internet era, essentially, my first real experience with this kind of criticism or analysis. So what I thought I would do is I'll just sort of, I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'll rattle off some of the main points, their main headings here, and I'll just get your response. And again, we're talking about this exact period of time. So we've had the Electric Superman saga. We've had that first Dominus storyline. We're in the midst, or just about, of 1 million. We're going to be heading into the King of the World storyline. So this is what Wizard had to say about Clark Kent at the time. So number one is stories, not events. Right. So they call out all the stories we've been talking about on the podcast: Dead Again, Death of Clark Kent, the Trial of Superman, the Electric Superman saga. So Wizard charges too many events at the expense of, more one-offs or two-part stories, smaller scale stories that tap more into the core of the character. So what's your take?
So I remember feeling that at the time. Um, and man grows older and suddenly things are very clear. And what I and in, especially in talking with the creators, which changes your perception of the story when you get the behind the scenes stuff. It kind of it may not like completely change your mind, but it gives a little more context to it. They're not wrong, but also that was what was working. So it's kind of hard. What they're basically telling the creators is, that thing that's kind of kept your story engine running. You need to stop doing that. that feels like it's coming from somebody that's almost like on the outside looking in, saying, "Well, they're doing all these events, they're not really doing stories," and to a certain extent, they're not wrong. But also, if you look at the Electric Blue era, that's not a storyline; that's an era. So there's different things happening within that. Um, so I partially agree, but only because I know how the story ends.
Agreed. I think there's, and I've talked about this, but I think there is a certain stretch in, like the fall of Metropolis and Dead Again and Death of Clark. There is a stretch where I was feeling that a little bit, but when we get into the Lois and Clark breakup and even the Electric Superman saga, like as much as we have that, gimmick as our initial setup, we're settling into, like you said, this era, and we're getting a lot of different kinds of stories. So yeah, I sort of I only agree with this to a point. Rogues Gallery. The next item sort of calls out the villains who were plaguing Superman at the time, and how basically we needed some heavier hitters. Their "How'd we fix it" section says, let's see. Oh, set up Mongol and Brainiac as the ruthless monsters they are. Don't overuse Cyborg or Doomsday. Make their appearances count. Find a way to bring back Conduit and the Eradicator. Well, I'm always on board for Conduit. And try to find a way to make Bizarro more than a joke. So, uh, yeah. So kind of on this note of the villains.
Um, Doomsday wasn't around that long, all that much, y'all. He really wasn't there. I mean, if you look at Doomsday's appearances, it's like the main storyline, Hunter Prey, and the Doomsday Wars. It's almost like they were looking into the future, where Doomsday, like Jeff Loeb had a army of Doomsdays in the second Superman Batman arc. Um, I disagree with this because mainly I liked the villains that we were getting. Uh, Odd that somebody wants to bring back Conduit, because I think you and I are the only ones that really like that character. But what I like about that character is that he served a very specific function, and then he was taken off the table, which isn't something that happens normally with Superman villains. Uh, I also wonder if Jeff Loeb was reading this, because this is one of those stupid things. Why do I remember this? But when he was going to take over Superman, he got onto the DC message boards and was like, I am going to have Superman throw down with the heavy hitters of the DC universe. And I'm just like, okay, maybe DC read this article and took it to heart, but I don't agree with it, with that, because when you like, I love Mongol, and when done right, like in the recent Philip Kennedy Johnson storyline, he's great. He's not a mainstay villain. He's not an overarching villain. I don't even think Brainiac is. I think those are characters you bring out for big stories, but I don't know. I think they're looking for something that isn't there, and making assumptions that aren't there either.
Fair. This next one is a big one. The supporting cast. So Wizard sort of calls out the what they describe as this, or I'm paraphrasing, but this ballooning supporting cast, and that we're sort of losing the focus on the core of Clark and Lois and the Kents. I mean, we've talked about this in recent episodes. For me, look, I've been singing the praises of the supporting cast. I think that's the highlight of this Triangle era and what builds out the world of Metropolis and makes you care and pulls you in. At the same time, in this stretch that I've been covering recently, when we get into the Scorn and Ashbury uh, period of this, that's where I feel like I hit a little bit of a breaking point. I feel like that's where we were stretching it too thin. But where do you land on this?
Oh, I'm in the exact same place. Like when it was Kat and Jimmy and Lois, and they brought in Ron Troop, and I liked him. It was just like that was enough. But man, they latched onto Ashbury and Scorn like they were going to get their own series. And that's my memory of it. Now, if I go and read it again, I may not feel that way. I don't think that I think I'm going to still feel the same way. But I remember around this time going, why are we spending so much time with? I mean, they're interesting characters, but I want to see Superman. I want to see Clark and Lois and all that. And I'm wondering if this was the creative teams kind of running out of steam with, I mean, there's only so many Superman stories you can tell. And I can see Ashbury and Scorn being kind of a crutch. It's just like, well, I don't really know what to do with Lois and Clark in this issue, so we'll shift the focus over to the Rush Limbaugh type character in Dirk Armstrong, and his daughter and her alien boyfriend that wears a Superman shirt and has tusks. it's just like, how can I like something and still not want as much of it as we were getting?
Yes. No, I agree. I think credit to Wizard on that one. This next one, man, do I disagree with this? But romantic tension. They sort of want to play up, as they say, the way it should be. Clark Kent has options. So how do we fix it? Is that Clark and Lois should be rivals, not married. By separating or divorcing them, it would open a lot of romantic possibilities. Plus, it would be fun to see Clark walk on eggshells again whenever he interacted with Lois.
As somebody that absolutely hated that era where they were broken up before the wedding, like hated it. Um, Hated it in 1996. Hated it last year when I read it again. No, no. This is I. I don't think the Clark Kent and Lois's rivals thing works as well as people say it does, and I think history has evolved to show that to be the case. When you look at like Lois and Clark, where she finds out after the fact, but around the time they get engaged, to Smallville, where she finds out before he officially becomes Superman, to like Man of Steel, where she's there on the ground floor, essentially. Uh, I think history has proven that while that was good for a certain era, no, these two just need to be together. That's just it.
I agree with all of that, and I think we've seen enough instances that really show and prove that. I mean, the one thing I will say, if you're not going to have them together, let Clark explore the other options. That's why, look, and I was super skeptical of New 52, but when I finally started to read it and I delved into the Clark and Diana relationship, again, is it my preferred version? No, of course it's not. But reading it, it's like, well, okay, like at least this is a little something different and it's something new to explore. But yeah, no, overall, I disagree with this. I'm skipping over some. One of them is about the secret. The wizard felt that too many people knew his secret identity, and it's like, I don't know, at this point in time, I mean, I don't know. I guess
The,
it's all relative, but in the years to come, it's like far more people would know. So
I mean, Lana kept it from her husband, and she had a kid with him.
I know. It's oh my god,
And that's Clark's best friend from high school.
it's insane. All right, the last big one here is, and I think maybe this speaks to what you were saying about them running out of steam, but format. So Wizard charges there was too much Superman, right? We had 5 ongoing titles, the 4 monthlies plus the quarterly Man of Tomorrow. They said that DC should strip it down to 2 titles, Superman in Action, just like Marvel was doing at the time with its Spider-Man relaunch with Amazing and Peter Parker Spider-Man. Uh, yeah, I mean, where do you land on something like that, especially at this point in time where we're still having these 52 Superman comics a year?
It's a tricky one because I have really come to the conclusion that the Triangle era should have ended when Berganza took over, like officially ended. I know Loeb hated it. Um, he didn't. They wanted to tell their own stories, and here's the thing: if you don't have everyone bought in on the concept, and if you don't have an editor that is going to have the hand that Mike Carlin had, it's not going to work as well. And I think you saw that. It's nothing against Joey Cavalieri as an editor. Um, he oversaw. He had the unenviable task of following. Now, technically, he followed K.C. Carlson because he was the editor for like 5 minutes after Mike Carlin became like managing editor. Uh, but he had the unenviable task of following Death of Superman, which was still fresh in everyone's minds. So, but you still had the like enough of the core people where it could like come together, and I think nobody else can do that. If you don't have Jurgens and Simonson and Kessel and Ordway was scripting over Kessel, uh, if you don't have those and if you don't have those people kind of all working together and gelling, then yeah, you don't need the four titles, because the great thing about the four titles is that it was essentially a weekly Superman comic. Um, it's interesting again that they seem to be looking into the future, because eventually this is exactly what, after Infinite Crisis, this is exactly what DC did. They had action and they had Superman.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's true. I mean, look, two of our earliest episodes on this podcast were the Loeb Kelly era, because that I have a very special place for that time, and I still do, and I enjoyed rereading them. But yeah, it's definitely, and especially now having read and reread the Triangle era leading up to it, yeah, it's a different flavor. It's not the same thing. It's not that interconnected weekly adventure, right? And I agree with you. They should have just, I mean, it took them until after our worlds at war, but they really should have ditched them right off the bat and just, had whenever they did a crossover story, then you could use them then, maybe use them sparingly. We'd see that later on too, right? Like in the
Hmm.
new Krypton saga, like they would use them occasionally. But yeah, it definitely was a different thing. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe Wizard had a crystal ball, and or people who then were in a position to do something about it were reading that article and being like, "Oh yeah, it's a good idea."
Yeah, because when you look at what happens like right after this, and are you going to continue next year and continue into the Loeb and the end of the Triangle era, or are you tapping out?
Maybe this is more for off mic, but my feeling was we already covered the Loeb Kelly era, but we did it in 2 episodes, right? So that's a tremendous amount of material to cover, and I love doing these Triangle era events. So as much as officially I was looking at Electric Till 1 Million as the finale of this Triangle era trilogy we've been doing, I am now kind of thinking, well, maybe we go back, and maybe it'd be interesting to take another look at the Loeb Kelly era after all of this and take our time with it more, right? We wouldn't do just 2 episodes. We'd make a little bit more of a meal out of it. So there might be something like that.
There are people that have asked Jeff and I why we're going all the way to 2006, because for a lot of people it ended in 1999. Um, and my answer to that is I named the show From Crisis to Crisis, so I'm kind of locked into I'm locked into a time frame.
Yeah, no, but I mean, that totally makes sense. But yeah, that's that'll keep you busy. But listen, this was really a lot of fun. I so appreciate
Mhm.
you taking the time and coming on, and like I said, just for all of your support generally. Where should people go to follow you and your podcast?
Fortressofbaileytude.com, which I call it the Fortress of Baileytude Podcasting Network, only because I just wanted a central location for everything. I used to have like a different blog for every show, and that was just a nightmare to keep up with. So everything's there. The shows that are going on right now, are From Crisis to Crisis is back for the time being. It all comes back to Superman comes out very irregularly. I'm trying to get a bunch in the can so that I can do that. And that's more kind of like this show, where I just take a different thing that I don't normally talk about on the other show to examine, even though I've broken that rule a bunch of times. There's also the Overlooked Dark Knight, where me and my friend Andy look at Batman stories that no one really talks about. And every once in a while, we actually stick to that remit as well. The thing about podcasting is you make rules immediately to break them. Uh, that's just and every Monday night at 10:30 Eastern, Steve Eunice and I have the Superman homepage, do an hour-long show called Superman Homepage Live, where we talk about the latest in Superman news. So I'm pretty easy to find. You can find that at supermanhomepage.com.
Very cool. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. I assume many already have. Again, you've been at this for a while, and I'm sure people are familiar. But if not, make sure you check that out. So, Michael, really thank you again. It was great to meet you and to have this conversation. It was really a blast.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I was really looking forward to this, because, like I said, I really like the show and getting to come out and play. One of the great things I have found about Superman podcasters is that normally we really like talking to each other
Yes.
and teaming up, and I think that's just reflective of the character in general. So,
Well said. And speaking of future or team ups generally, you'll also be a guest very soon on my George Reeves rewatch podcast, another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. So that'll be coming up soon as well.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that because that is an insane episode.
Yes, that'll be a lot of fun. So I hope people will stay tuned for that. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, audience, as always. I really appreciate it. Make sure you come back next week as we continue along with Electric Till 1 Million. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.